Have you ever watched that series called A Thousand Ways to Die? Well, when you examine our species' 300,000-year journey through time, you'll quickly discover that 1,000 barely scratches the surface. We're talking about millions of ways, and even that might not be enough. Throughout history, humans have faced some truly agonizing deaths, with certain endings being far more brutal than others. Fortunately, thanks to modern advances and technological progress, these horrific fates are becoming rarer compared to earlier times, mainly because ancient Earth was incredibly more dangerous than our current world. We can only imagine the horrors our ancestors endured, but sometimes we don't need to guess. Occasionally, scientists strike gold at the cost of some deeply unlucky individual, allowing us to witness firsthand the devastating wounds that ancient people suffered, and sometimes even overcame. However, our first example definitely wasn't a survival story. This unfortunate case represents a death that's still possible today, a shark attack. But this wasn't just any ordinary shark encounter. This was the first documented shark attack in recorded history, an unwanted record that belongs to a 400-year-old hunter-gatherer from Japan, simply called Suomo 24. The find happened in 2021 near the Seto Inland Sea, where scientists discovered a male human skeleton in terrible condition, completely covered in cuts that spread across his arms, chest, stomach, and hands. Initially, researchers were both horrified and puzzled because these wounds were so severe they marked the bone and resembled injuries from metal weapons rather than animals or primitive tools like stone blades. What made it even more shocking was that they weren't examining just a few slashes or even dozens, but over 500, exactly 790 to be precise. The situation became stranger when they realized this man belonged to the Jomon culture, which had no metalworking, ruling out a crazed serial killer with metal weapons, so they re-examined the wounds, and noticed this time that they were V-shaped, and matched those seen in contemporary shark attacks. Combined with his location on an archipelago, they concluded that either a large tiger shark or great white had killed him, and really torn him apart during the assault, inflicting multiple fatal injuries, including fracturing or tearing every rib, gutting his chest and abdomen, and, to make matters worse, multiple amputations, including both feet and his left hand. These missing body parts also told researchers that the poor man was conscious during the initial attack, since he probably used his hands and feet to fight back. When they were bitten off, this eliminated the possibility of it being a scavenging incident rather than an attack, but raised a new question about why the shark targeted him initially, as his left leg showed the deepest bites, strongly suggesting an unprovoked ambush attack. The answer lay in his strange final burial location. Instead of being discovered at sea as expected, or in a place that was once underwater, the victim was found in a traditional gravesite, and his body showed no signs of prolonged water exposure, meaning he probably wasn't alone when attacked. Since the Jomon people were skilled fishermen, the current theory is that a group had gone out fishing, when at some point during their expedition, the unlucky man entered the water, perhaps to spearfish or retrieve a catch, unaware that spilled blood had drawn a shark that quickly struck. Seeing him in danger and under assault, his companions rescued him, but it was too late, and they could only give him a proper burial, as he likely died well before reaching shore. Now, if you're planning a Japan trip, don't worry just yet. Yes, sharks still exist there, but conditions were much more dangerous back then, with numerous shark teeth suggesting their populations were considerably larger than today. This is also shown in Jomon culture, which includes many artworks depicting different sharks, especially hammerheads and tiger sharks, so attacks were probably much more frequent in those days. Obviously, this particular case had a tragic outcome, but not all severe injuries ended so badly. Sometimes ancient humans not only survived traumatic wounds, but actually flourished afterward, as perfectly demonstrated by the world's oldest known amputation, dating back 31,000 years. For ages, researchers knew that amputations happened before modern medicine, but the oldest known case was only 7,000 years old, involving a Neolithic farmer from Europe, so everyone was quite thrilled when, in 2020, a team of scientists discovered a much older specimen in Borneo, showing evidence of a successful amputation. The person in question was found in the Liang Tibo cave, and notably was missing their left leg and foot. Initially, there was speculation that it was lost in some terrible accident that then killed the individual. Yet researchers observed that not only was the wound remarkably clean, but it had also healed and appeared intentional, and the remaining leg was partially shrunken and child-sized, while the specimen overall was clearly a young adult, making childhood amputation the most likely explanation. Since this occurred over 30,000 years ago, painkillers were probably non-existent, and the amputation would have been performed with a sharpened stone tool. Yet somehow, the ancient surgeon not only managed to skillfully navigate around veins, arteries, nerves, and tissue, but kept the area completely infection-free, a feat still remarkable by today's standards, since some studies show infection rates up to 40% after major amputations. The prehistoric individual went on to survive into adulthood, only dying in their 20s, from something unrelated and currently unknown. But this raises the question of why they needed an amputation in the first place. A possible explanation relates to their living area, as the terrain around the cave is extremely rough, elevated, and filled with large rocks and cliffs. Therefore, the person could have suffered a particularly severe fall or been struck by a rock that crushed their leg to the point where amputation became necessary. While it's believed they survived nearly a decade after the incident, it wouldn't have been simple, as they still had to navigate mountainous terrain with one leg, and therefore must have depended considerably on others for care, showing one of the earliest examples of human compassion. But unfortunately, we also know that humans in the past, and for that matter present, can be quite brutal. And you know this well if you watched my recent video about the Neolithic bottleneck, a period of unusually savage violence that could be downright terrifying. One of the worst examples was seen in the caves of Saint-Paul-Trois-Châteaux in France. This gruesome discovery involved 3 women found buried together in the 1980s, but dated to about 500 years ago. And only recently did scientists reveal that a cruel, sacrificial ritual had occurred. In total, 3 victims were discovered, yet 2 were buried in very twisted positions and crammed into very tight spaces, while being completely covered by heavy grinding stones, likely meant to hold them down and prevent movement, indicating that these 2 had been buried alive against their will. Furthermore, the positions of their arms and legs suggested that while now decayed, rope had at some point not only bound them, but tied their legs to their necks, causing them to involuntarily strangle themselves, coincidentally mirroring a torturous execution method, sometimes used by the Italian mafia called incapretamento. However, while the mafia does this today for revenge against betrayers, these Neolithic murders were some kind of agricultural sacrifice, buried in a structure that resembled a grain silo. The 3rd woman was buried above them, unbound and above the stones, presumably for symbolic purposes. The location was also quite unusual, as it was constructed so that during the solstice, the sun would shine directly on the silo. In other words, whoever orchestrated this was quite twisted, yet undeniably well organized. A less organized but stranger and rarer killing occurred not long before this. However, this incident happened on the opposite side of the world, and involved the only known prehistoric human to be found in a tar pit. The La Brea woman. In case you didn't know, Los Angeles is home to the La Brea tar pits, which is actually an active paleontology site that has functioned as a predator trap for tens of thousands of years. Animals who became stuck in the sticky tar would in turn attract many unknowingly doomed carnivores believed to be up to 50,000 years old. Over the years, paleontologists have recovered thousands of iconic Ice Age specimens like dire wolves, ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, American lions, mammoths, mastodons, and then primates, or rather a primate to be specific, a lone woman believed to have been between 18 to 30 years old at death. The La Brea woman is a well-preserved skeleton, consisting of skull, jaw, and postcranial material. In life, she likely stood around 4 feet 10 inches or 1.5 meters tall, and lived some 10,000 years ago, where, based on her teeth, she sustained herself on a diet heavy in stone-ground meal that apparently led to dental problems, and could have caused considerable pain in life. But putting all that aside, the biggest issue obviously had to do with her being buried in the tar pit. This was quite strange, since Paleo-Indians were definitely well aware that such a pit was dangerous and best avoided, which led researchers to suspect that she had a rather sinister helping hand in ending up there. Upon further examination, they did indeed find that her jaw had actually been broken, while her skull had been fractured and possessed a small hole in it, indicative of a powerful blow, and not one from an animal, but rather from a fellow human. If accurate, this would make her LA's oldest known murder victim, given the skeleton's age. Though highly debated, it's been theorized that she belonged to the Chumash people. Yet why she was attacked is unknown, nor whether the attack came from her own group over personal conflict, or originated from a hostile party seeking resources and potentially viewing her as a threat. Additionally, even though her wounds were almost certainly fatal, given the medical knowledge at the time, it's unclear if she died first and then was dumped in the tar pit, or if she was thrown in while wounded, but actually died from sinking and suffocating in the tar. Obviously, neither is a pleasant way to go. And honestly, I'm not sure if I'd rather be clubbed or drowned. Unfortunately, we know that definitely happened with another specimen who is now known as the first modern human we know of to have drowned, and ironically, he did so in one of the driest places on Earth, the Atacama Desert. This harsh and unforgiving region is found in Chile and is perhaps the oldest desert on the planet, meaning that regardless, this Neolithic man who dated to 500 years ago still lived in the area when it was absolutely arid, yet his body was found in a round stone structure on top of seashells, which does make sense because he lived on the coast, meaning water was accessible. Originally, scientists weren't sure what happened to him, since he wasn't very old, being about 35 to 45 years old at death. And he didn't have any obvious fatal injury or disease either. However, because he lived close to the sea and was buried with lots of shells, there was a thought that he drowned. But how does one determine if a 5,000-plus-year-old man drowned with just bones? Surprisingly, you examine those bones and look for diatoms, which are basically any member of a large group comprising several genera of algae, and indeed, diatoms were found in his skeleton, implying that he drowned. Let's just say that's a very unpleasant sign, because the only way diatoms can end up in one's bones is if you inhale water, such that when it reaches the lungs, your pulmonary alveoli rupture, where then salt water rushes into your bloodstream before making it into your bone marrow, and hence the presence of these algae. So a very brutal ending for an already harsh life. As it turns out, the man was already in very poor condition, showing signs of having arthritis severe enough to damage his bones, and his legs were roughed up as well, suggesting a life spent crouching, perhaps to harvest shells, while his arms and shoulders were further damaged, reflecting a life rich in swimming, rowing, and harpooning, which matches the assumption that he was part of a coastal community. Just for a cherry on top, he also appeared to be extremely iron deficient, and that was attributed to a severe tapeworm infection, which can be common in mishandled fish. Just to make everything slightly more tragic, it turns out he did not die alone, but with 3 others, another male, an adult female, and even one infant. Radiocarbon dating found that all 4 had died at the same time. But how, you might ask? Well, they lived in a very seismically active area, and so it's believed that an earthquake and subsequent tsunami is what killed them. But what's rather peculiar is that when they tested the rest of the skeletons for diatoms, they found none, heavily suggesting that, unlike the man, they had not drowned. So now, while it's still possible that an earthquake killed them from non-drowning related dangers, it's now less likely that a tsunami and earthquake caused their deaths. And the current hypothesis is that the man simply accidentally drowned, maybe while diving to forage, while the others just happened to die around the same time and location from other causes. After all, the Atacama Desert was and is a very punishing place, where it could be hot, cold, and very, very dry. Although it should be said that Earth back then was also just generally tough, regardless of location, and sometimes we humans made it more painful than it already was, and had to be. I mean, just look at this guy, or this girl, or really any of the other 38 humans found in France with holes in their skulls. What you're looking at is not a mass murder, crime scene, or even warfare, but rather a poor attempt at surgery, also known as trepanation, which, as the skulls show, involved drilling a hole into one's head, and was perhaps Homo sapiens' first widespread surgery. Unfortunately, the site in France specifically dates to about 500 BC, but it was by no means isolated. and multiple sites have been found with evidence of this strenuous procedure, supplying us with an abundance of brutal fossils. Some studies even suggest that up to 10% of all Neolithic people underwent this treatment, if you can call it that. And in the French site, it was closer to 33%. Given the super high rate, you'd assume it was pretty safe. But it's about what you'd expect from drilling a hole in your head, and less than 40% of the skulls showed any signs of healing, meaning more than 60% died, with the main causes of death likely being infection, blood loss, and of course trauma to the brain if the surgeon went too deep. Even if they were in the metaphorical clear, healing was no joke, often taking several months for the area to close up, and even then, you'd likely still feel terrible. Plus the fact you had to endure the surgery itself, which definitely took place with no painkillers or anesthesia. To do the surgery, it's thought that sharpened stone knives, or in some cases even seashells, were used to carry out the procedure, and people at virtually every age were found having done this. So looking at the widespread nature of this procedure, you might ask, what was the purpose? Well, basically anything. According to some, potential reasons included spiritual purposes, treatment for epilepsy, relieving head wounds, which were more common at the time, courtesy of ourselves. Or it could have been done for something as simple as a headache. So basically, if you woke up in ancient times and you had a throbbing migraine, best to keep that to yourself. Perhaps surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, this surgery remained popular for quite some time, and actually is still carried out today, just with a bit more precision and only done in select cases. Not to mention, we now have much better management for the procedure and pain. Speaking of pain, there's something we seem to have left behind too. Of course, it's still a thing, but I more mean that life used to be so much more harsh and agonizing due to lesser technology. I mean, just ask the girl of Uchter Moor, effectively known as Moora by some. She is an Iron Age specimen that is also a bog body, in other words, a human that was found and sometimes naturally mummified within a peat bog. Just in case you're wondering what that is, it is a wetland that has accumulated peat, surprise, surprise, and other decayed organic material. Moora was originally located in the year 2000, and her discoverers actually thought that she had been a girl that went missing after visiting a club many decades before. But after doing some testing, they realized that she was in reality a 1,000-plus-year-old skeleton who had lived in Iron Age Germany, despite only being around 17 to 19. She had endured more pain than most in their lifetime. Just about every bit of her body had some sort of damage to it, and even looking at it as a whole, researchers concluded that she must have led a life of intense physical labor, probably consisting of carrying heavy loads like water jugs, as she routinely navigated through the marshlands. Her head had not one but two severe fractures that had healed over, demonstrating brain injuries that might have come from attacks by hostile people or even people within her own community, with their shape reflecting blunt impacts. We do know that head trauma and violence were somewhat more common during the Iron Age, but at any rate, she definitely survived that specific ordeal. Yet she likely suffered from frequent headaches and potentially other neurological symptoms. It really seems like she couldn't catch a break, because she also appeared to have a benign tumor at the base of her skull that likely just compounded her already existing headaches, while also causing a curvature in her spine, leading to back pain and chronically inflamed legs, which was severe enough to alter her bones. While her own body seemed to be against her, so did the environment, as there were further signs that during harsh winters, she endured frequent periods of sickness, and in her childhood had chronic malnutrition, reflected by the unusual morphology of her bones. In other words, each day would have been a challenge for her, even if she didn't have to do anything, let alone survive during the Iron Age. She clearly did not last long, because even 19 was considered below the life expectancy, which at that point hovered around 26 years old. We don't know what killed her, but it's believed that thankfully, murder was off the table, considering that there are no clear signs, and right now it's tentatively believed that she died in a freak accident. However, one mystery that remains is that she was found alone and naked, with not even any objects or jewelry being associated with her, suggesting that someone had altered her body after death, and then presumably buried her in the bog, which again makes one wonder why not just bury her on land? The answer is that maybe they were trying to hide something. Sadly, Not even in death did Moor get a break, as when she was recovered back in the day. It was done accidentally after a machine had scooped up her remains, but not before ripping them into 100 different pieces that needed to be stitched back together. So with that example alone, I think we can conclude that life can really just be dang hard, which is a fact shared by what is currently the first known victim of the plague, a 5,000-year-old hunter-gatherer from present-day Latvia. He showed signs of having died around the age of 20, and likely did so after being bitten and infected by a rodent. That unassuming bite would one day come to doom him, as it happened to be laced with a bacteria that humanity knows all too well, Yersinia pestis. In other words, the bacteria responsible for the plagues, like that of Justinian and the Black Death. So, not good. Now, when you get the plague, it usually comes in 3 different forms: pneumonic, septicemic, and bubonic. And while we don't know which one the man had, it clearly killed him, and, unbeknownst to him, would proceed to kill over 100 million other people through the years, which is crazy. I mean, seriously, nature just seemed to be more messed up back then. I already know I mentioned it, but we as humanity seem to follow that trend, especially during the Neolithic, and there's a buffet of mangled skeletons to choose from that time, and that pun is intended, because many of them showed signs of cannibalism. Additionally, we also have nicely preserved specimens that show us that one could go through dismemberment, decapitation, being burned alive, stabbed, bludgeoned, shot with an arrow, or sometimes a combination of all these things together. Obviously, while violence still occurs, in many ways it is comparatively much more tamed in the present. I should also mention, there's also the trend of doing this to large groups as well. Over 100 mass murder sites are known from throughout the world, showcasing ancient man's enthusiasm for violence and creativity and cruelty. Maybe the takeaway is that for all the flaws of the present, maybe today isn't so bad after all. Thanks for watching, and until next time on AnthroWild.